Well, hello everyone. I'm Tyler Chrestman, and welcome to the Chrestman Conversation. Today, we're going to do something that's going to be kind of fun. Not necessarily the most relevant thing in the news, kind of on the periphery. We're not talking about George Floyd or anything like that, but we're talking about something on the periphery of that. We're going to discuss something that happened to me yesterday, which was actually, it was kind of interesting. I was having a discussion turned argument with someone yesterday, and we're going to discuss one of the things that they were using as evidence to support their argument, which to me was just hilarious because it's so bad. We're going to watch a YouTube video together. It's relatively short, it's about 6 minutes long. We're going to watch that video together. I'm going to pause it at different points, and I'm just going to, obliterate it. It's a terrible video. It really is. It's an awful video. Been viewed 1.1 million times. And I've been seeing it on the internet recently. This person who I was arguing with yesterday sent it to me. And after I laid out a series of points as to why the video was bad, I was then accused of all sorts of terrible negative things. Side note, it is really, really bad form to attribute negative motives to people during an argument, to sort of malign someone's motives as being evil in some way when you're having a discussion about points. I might disagree with someone about a whole bunch of things, but I rarely accuse people of malevolence in their intent. And that was what this person did after I disagreed with them on a whole bunch of things. Just made really terrible arguments. And I love discussion. Anyone who disagrees with me on things, and we've ever had a conversation in person, knows that outside of this forum, outside of the podcast, where I sometimes might come across as a bit, I don't know. I don't even know what the right word would be in this case. I sometimes come across very strongly on the podcast. Anyone who's ever talked to me about things in real life knows I'm relatively well even keel. I don't like to argue about things in a way that people get upset. Not about political discussions. That's not the case for most people, and it's so annoying. So anyway, the argument yesterday was just nonsense. It started off as a nice discussion, and then quickly devolved into her calling me a whole bunch of nasty names, which I'm not going to repeat here because they're very mean and hurtful. And so instead what we're going to do is watch the video that she uses her crowning evidence, and then talk about all the ways why it's terrible. So anyway, here we go. We're going to jump right into it. The video is called The Science of Racism by Creators for Change. It's a YouTube video. We're going to watch it together so you don't have to ever waste time watching it again because it's pretty terrible. And it's going to be enlightening. We're going to learn lots is what's going to happen. So here we go. We're gonna play it. We're gonna give it a shot.
Racism is real.
And it can not only cause psychological pain,
but also physiological damage to those who experience it.
So today we're going to look at the science of racism, using studies and evidence to see exactly how it impacts individuals, uncover what makes people racist in the first place, and understand what we can do to successfully combat it right now.
Every time a resume comes across somebody's desk, the name on it makes a difference. After sending out over 1,300 fake resumes in response to employment ads, scientists found that resumes with more traditionally sounding black names receive 50% fewer callbacks than those with more white-sounding names. Again, these resumes are literally identical, except for the names. This shows how one aspect of racism can have a significant impact on opportunity.
Okay, so right off the bat, let's show everyone. I'm not in sort of an ideological bubble here. I've heard of this study before, this resume study going on, and I found it rather compelling. It's interesting because it appears to account for other factors. It appears a very controlled study that came out that basically showed that black sounding names get less callbacks. That seems to be a compelling evidence for some sort of racism in certain systems, in certain hiring practices. So right there, congratulations, point to the video. That's actually a good argument. And so right off the bat, there you go. There's your breadcrumb. That's a good argument. I don't think, and it's and right where we find it, we should fix it. So if you can point to a specific company that did this in their hiring practices, yeah. And first of all, probably sue the shit out of that company. That sounds like racism, and we don't like racism. I certainly don't. I don't know a lot of people that do. We don't like racism. Get rid of it. So again, there's the olive branch right there. This is actually a good part in this video. This the first 47 seconds of the video, kind of nice. So we're going to continue.
Now, classism is a huge issue. Studies show that if you grow up in poverty, you'll experience more discrimination than people that are wealthier than you. But even when black and white people grow up in wealthy families and have similar education, even though they start wealthy, black boys are more likely to end up poor. One of the major factors can start as early as...
So right here, you'll notice how there's a subtle shift in exactly what she says, where she's talking about black people who grew up in affluence and then quickly switches to black boys who grew up in affluence. Now, my question is this. There was and this drives me crazy. Also notice they never cite a source in this video. You have to hunt down their sources. I'm going to cite a source for everything that I use to refute them, but listen to them. They never cite a source, so you can't do any fact checking without some digging, which I had to do. I'm going to cite a source for everything I use. She switches this to black boys as opposed to black people. Black boys who grow up in affluence tend to earn less overall than white boys who grow up in affluence. And the reason that she makes this switch is very important. The reason that she makes this switch is because if you look at black women, and this is from the Stanford, Harvard, and the Census Bureau. That's where this graph comes from. If you look at the earning over here on the left, you'll see that white men and black men who both come from higher income households when they're young, white men tend to out-earn black men overall throughout the entire course of their lives. However, if you look at the gap, black women raised in affluence versus white women raised in affluence, black women tend to out-earn white women throughout the entire course of their lives. And this is interesting to me because what we're saying right now is that racism is bad. And then we're saying that also sexism is bad. But for whatever reason, black women raised in affluence will out-earn white women raised in similar circumstances. So what they do is they don't mention this fact in this video at all, because what they're doing is saying, well, look, black boys who are raised in rich households actually earn less than white people raised in rich households. Therefore, racism, explain then the fact that why black women out-earn white women when raised in similar circumstances. How are we explaining that fact away? Does racism not affect black women? Why is it only affecting black men in this case? So this argument right here is ridiculous, and they fail to mention this because it undercuts their argument, because they're saying, well, look, so what you're saying basically is that in 50% of the cases, racism is a problem, 50% it's not a problem? I don't understand. How is racism only targeting black men in this case and not black women? Again, the argument is just, it's silly on its face, because it makes absolutely no sense when you account for the fact that it only works in half the cases. Anyway, let's continue. We've shown the graph. Let's continue.
Where teachers are more likely to punish black students over white students for the same behavior. Even in adulthood, prison sentences for the same crime are 10% longer for black men, and the use of force is 3.6 times higher.
When studying the existence of racism...
All right, right there. We're stopping it again. Black boys punished worse than white boys for similar instances in school. That's not true. It really isn't. So when she's citing that study, Jason Riley wrote a book where he talked about this gap in punishment, where they're talking about the basically the school to prison pipeline. Well, what he found, and again, Jason Riley is black. This is not some racist white person out here justifying racism. This is a black man trying to do an analytical analysis of why there is this discrepancy. What he found was that black children are punished more often, but by self-reported behavior, they also act out more. And so he was finding that kids act out more in school when they come from one-parent households. And one-parent households are more prevalent in the black community. So kids who come from homes without a father have more discipline problems than kids who don't. And so there's a discrepancy in the amount of acting out that occurs at school, and it's disproportionately young black children who, and again, this is not saying race has no factor in this. This is not a race factor. This is an unfortunate factor of the more people, the more adults you have in your household or in your community, the stronger the discipline tends to be in those households. And so that accounted for the discrepancy, but the idea that there's two kids, they both do the same thing, and that black children are punished worse, that is only because if you have a history of discipline problems, you get punished worse even if the incident is the same. So the one kid who acts out once doesn't get punished the same as the one kid who acted out in the same way, but it's the 10th time. So it's a silly argument based on evidence that's only half analyzed. You're saying, look, discrepancy, therefore racism. That's a terrible argument. It's always been a terrible argument. It never is going to be a good argument. The second bit of that is the exact same thing. Black males have prison sentences that are 10% longer. This is absolutely true. But again, that's not racism. That's not. It's been done. So the study, by the way, here's the funny fact. They cite a study where this comes from the Booker report. That's where this comes from. And here is the quote from the actual report that they are using as an example of racism. This is the quote from the Booker report in which says there's a 10% discrepancy in prison sentences. Here's the actual quote. Quote, "The commission noted some potentially relevant factors were not included in its analysis, such as whether the offender's criminal history included violent crime conduct, the offender's family ties, and the offender's employment history. Data was not readily available for those factors because the commission did not routinely extract the information from the court documents it receives. Therefore, for those prior analysis, the commission could not control for them. For this reason, caution should always be used when drawing conclusions based on multivariate regressive analysis." End quote. The own commission says we know that there are other factors besides race that are going to account for this discrepancy. When you take into account violent crime in a person's past, it narrows that gap. When you take violent crime out of it, when you take excuse me, when you take, for example, past criminal history, not violent crime, which again is another way of saying, oh look, that's not really true. When you take past criminal conduct or arrests and convictions into account, it narrows that gap to almost non-existence. So for example, two people are arrested for the same crime, one white, one black. If somebody has previous arrests in their history, that person will get sentenced longer despite the fact they're convicted for the same crime. This is common sense. This is a terrible argument that, again, is totally disproven when you take it outside of face value. So what they do is, what this entire video does is spot a discrepancy and then say racism without doing any other work to try and explain the gap. It's lazy and it's bad science, and it drives me nuts that people watch a video like this and think that it's good. We're a minute and 25 seconds in. This is a 6-minute video. As you can tell, I'm all fired up because this whole conversation I had yesterday really pissed me off. It was super annoying. And so here we go. We're going to keep going. We just got to keep going. We got to push through.
Towards indigenous people in Australia.
Oh my goodness. There we go. All right. We're back at it.
45% of indigenous families reported racism. And interestingly, scientists began to link these experiences to poor mental health status, sleep difficulties, obesity, and even asthma. Which brings up an important fact. Racism can truly be damaging to your health.
Now, racism involves...
Okay. So people self-report racism in 45% of the cases. Indigenous people, they said, we self-identify as experiencing racism. That's terrible. We don't want people to feel like there's racism in society, and that's bad. Then they go on to say, and now it's linked to asthma and obesity and all these other things. This, again, this is the definition. The definition of really bad science. Any sort of correlative study, anything that says one thing happened, this other thing happened, therefore this one thing caused the other thing. This is actually just a logical fallacy called correlation causation. This idea, post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore because of this. This is a bad argument to make in general. Any person worth their salt would not think that this is a good argument to say. People self-report that they experience racism and they have health problems. Therefore, racism and health. That's what this is doing. I doubt that any factor, any analysis of this situation controlled for every other factor and just said, aha, therefore racism leads to the gap. There's absolutely no way that happened. None whatsoever. And if you're going to talk correlation causation, let's talk correlation causation. Look at these fun graphs. How about this? How about U.S. spending on science and suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation? Look at this graph. Obviously, the more we spend on science and technology, the more people are going to die by strangulation and suffocation. We need to stop spending on science. That's what this is. How could anyone refute this graph? The number of people who drown by falling in a pool and films of Nicolas Cage. Nicolas Cage needs to appear in less movies because look at these graphs right here. You're seeing the drownings. They are clearly reflective of the amount of movies that Nicolas Cage is in. This is unheard of. The fact that we allow that man to star in movies at all is just insane. I can't believe it. Oh my gosh, this one right here. This is a national tragedy. The amount of cheese consumption per capita is directly correlated with the amount of people who die being tangled in their bed sheets. Wisconsin, what are you doing? How are you allowing your cheese to be consumed when all these people die in their beds? It just doesn't make any sense to me how that could happen. This is what that study is. They're basically putting two things on a chart. They're saying, look, racism on one graph and poor health outcomes in another. And look, they're correlated. You have worse outcomes and you have worse racism in the same graph. Can you believe it? This is terrible science. It makes anyone worth their salt would look at this and say, oh, that's silly. Like it makes absolutely no sense. But no, apparently it's a good argument, according to some people. Oh my god, I'm fired up. It's so bad. It just drives me nuts. We're a minute and 45 seconds in, people. A minute and 45 seconds.
The set of people holding power over other people. And that imbalance in power is what causes stress. And again, this can be measured experimentally. When Latina students were paired...
They're going to measure it experimentally. Quick side note here. Any attempt to define racism and include the idea of a power imbalance is a purely political point. It's nonsense. Racism is bigotry based on race. That's what it is. It has nothing to do with power. Power is an entirely different thing. If you want to talk about oppression, then tell me, can a black person in Asia be racist against anyone? Is that possible? Can a white person in Asia be racist? Could I go to China and be racist against Chinese people? Is that possible? I hold no power in the Chinese political system. None whatsoever. Of course, anyone who would argue against that is just making a ridiculous point. Racism is bigotry based on race, and the attempt to redefine it as a power imbalance is, again, a purely political point used to make it so that it fits a narrative that whites are bad. That's what it is in this context. Whites are bad, racism's bad, and blacks can't be racist. That's all this is. It's all silly. An entire genre of thought is just foolish. It's just misplaced.
With people they've been told had racial bias against them, their cardiovascular stress response went up, compared to those who were partnered with people they told had no bias against them at all. Another study of Korean immigrants...
Here's a fun fact about that. If I put you in a group of people, regardless of race, if I put you in a group of people and said, these people don't like you, but you have to go work with them, it would stress you out. So yeah, I am absolutely positive that stressed them out. But this is actually a bad argument for that guy's point, which is the fact that, oh, you know what we need to do? We need to talk about white bigotry all the time and tell black people that America's out to get them, that white people are out to get them, that the system is rigged against them. If your argument is that when you explicitly tell people that there's bias against them, it increases their stress level, why don't we just not do that? Why don't we wait until there's actual racism like that manifests, and then we'll address that instead of just constantly talking about how bigotry is out there and people hate you? I think it actually undercuts your argument and supports my argument, which is that we should address racism when it occurs. But this constant need to berate people about privilege and about the systemic injustice, about the history of slavery, I think it's important that people know history, that they know about Jim Crow, that they know about the evils that happened in our past. But quit telling them that they're a victim constantly. It's just ridiculous.
Found that discrimination was linked to debilitating mental health effects, and the scientific community is now validating how racism plays a significant role in the formation of health disparities.
So much that there are now links to breast cancer, hypertension, and heart disease. The chronic...
Guys, racism causes breast cancer, obviously. Correlates, definitely causation here. I'm sure that scientists controlled for every other factor imaginable and then determined that racism is out there causing breast cancer. I'm absolutely sure that scientific study did that. That whatever the scientific study did that. They controlled for the 1,000 other things that could possibly cause breast cancer and determined that race is the one.
Stress of racism can have people leaning on negative health behaviors like smoking and drinking. In fact, the amount of racism that a person experiences in a year is positively correlated to the number of drinks
citing
and cigarettes consumed.
Of course, you'd expect that if you go to your doctor, your health would be in good hands. But racial biases exist here as well. Hundreds of medical physicians were asked to look over a case of either black or white patients who likely just suffered a heart attack. Those who scored higher on a racial bias test were less likely to prescribe black patients a drug that would reduce blood clots and prevent heart attacks. In fact, half of white medical students and residents still believe in false biological differences between white and black patients. Like that black patients are more pain tolerant than white patients because of less sensitive nerve endings and thicker skin. These false beliefs negatively contribute to medical treatment.
And
so here's one thing I'm unaware of this study when I watched this the first time. By the way, the rest of this stuff I already knew. Like I've already debunked all this nonsense before. This one I hadn't heard before. I had heard some similar things, but I've never looked into it. But what I find interesting about this, and I'd have to look more, is they specifically say medical students. They're saying medical students believe these false things. What year are they? Are we talking first-year medical students, or are we talking people who are about to be attendings? Because if we're talking first-year medical students and you're saying, guess what, they don't know medical science, I'm not surprised. So, I mean, what are we talking about? We should clarify that. And I would be more interested to see, do attendings believe that? Do attendings believe medical information that's not true? Because then that's something. But when you're saying medical students, that's broad. The medical school is like 10 years long. Are you talking people who just started? Are you talking people who are almost finished? There's a huge difference in the implications of that. And by the way, I want to see how it manifests in different treatments. I'm sure it does, but let's talk about that, because that also is interesting. Medical students, again, depending on their year, are not even responsible for treating patients yet. So let's hold off on that, because again, I'm less familiar with that.
With these biases don't outright refuse care to black patients,
so they're
and
not
they
really
probably
racist,
don't consider themselves racist.
But yet
these biases persist in society and in institutions, which means that many people still hold these beliefs and values. For example, studies show that most people perceive the faces of other races to be more angry than faces of their own race. Now, these findings make some people uncomfortable because it's hard to look at your own bias and where you sit in perpetuating some of these values and beliefs that don't do the good that we think we're doing. Now, the good news is there's a lot that we can do.
Implicit bias tests are a laughable joke. They are so bad. They have absolutely no standing in the real world. Here are some fun facts about implicit bias testing. 1, the results are not repeatable. If you take the same test multiple times, you will get different answers often. They're gameable. Once you take certain tests and you take them again, you learn the pattern and you actually perform better. You learn what to expect and you perform better. They're not good tests at all. That's why they're not valid in any courtroom, because they are bad tests, bad science. Also, there's not one single study that shows that implicit unconscious bias has any manifestation in the real world. So if you're telling me that people the thoughts in their head have no relation to their actions, right? So someone who scores really negatively on an implicit bias test, saying they have some sort of bias against blacks or Hispanics or Asians or whites, I don't care. They have some sort of negative bias against someone. I don't care. I don't care about the thoughts in your head. How do they act in the real world? Unless you can show me that implicit bias directly relates to that, I don't care. I do not care what your unconscious mind says, especially because of this next bit. This next bit he goes is exactly, might be a little bit later. This next bit he goes through is exactly proving my point. I do not care what your unconscious mind thinks. I don't. If it has no manifestation in the real world, it does not matter. Implicit bias testing is a joke. It's always been a joke. It's not real science. It's bad, bad science. Like this whole video on the science of racism is bad, bad science. Half-truths and misrepresenting facts. Let's go.
Combat racism and unlearn our own biases right now.
The thing is, we're not born racist.
No, we are not.
We learn
That is
biases
true.
from our environment and how
Racism
we
is
are
taught.
raised. When children are adopted before the age of 8 by someone of a different race, they actually develop the same facial recognition patterns of their adoptive parents rather than their own race. It shows that our ability to quickly judge other races is learned from our parents or our environment. This is why talking about racism and anti-racism is so important.
And if you do hold
Kinda
racial
undercuts
bias,
the point
the important thing to know is
that
that
you
you
made
can
earlier.
change your brain. A study of brain scans
study.
showed that a specific brainwave
study.
pattern
Why
occurred
don't you just tell
in
me the
those with
study?
racial bias when they saw a face that they perceived as threatening. But immediately after, a brainwave from the rational part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, came in and
Fancy brain
challenged
words.
that initial brainwave. Our brains and the neurons inside them are constantly
This is, by the way, exactly what I was talking about. It was about a minute later than I thought. If you have a thought, you're white, you see a black person, the unconscious part of your brain lights up with some sort of weird implicit bias thought that you have against them. Like, oh, I'm threatened because there's a black person. But then the conscious, rational part of your brain comes through and says, no, that's silly. Don't be threatened. He's black. He's not dangerous. And then in the real world, you say, hi, sir. Nice to meet you. Or you go walk down the street and you're like, oh, he's black. Who cares? Then what's the problem? Again, this is how we want people to act, right? You have thoughts all the time. You walk down the street, your brain thinks a thought, it doesn't manifest in reality, and you move on with your day. And it happens constantly. But yet, somehow, when it comes to race, implicit bias is a giant problem. It makes absolutely no sense. 1,000 times a day, your brain will think a thought that you just dismiss. You just say, nah, all right, and then it's gone. But no, when it comes to race, damn it, everything's important, even your unconscious mind. And your unconscious mind is super racist, you're racist, and you're bad. You're a bad person. You need to change. It's like, no, you're calm down.
rewiring. This means that you can literally retrain your brain and combat racist thoughts.
And here's an example of how. A study found racial bias
Study.
lessened
Another
after
study.
subliminal exposure to counter stereotypes. Participants were shown faces of popular celebrities of diverse races, including Beyonce, and this kind of priming led to decreased bias within seconds to minutes. This emphasizes the scientific importance of representation in media.
This might seem a little
Very
obvious,
scientific.
but people who spend more time with different races and different backgrounds show less bias.
You are
This
right,
is
that
called
is obvious.
contact theory, where intergroup contact reduces intergroup
Now, this is actually a good point. That's why you see communities that have little minority representation, why they tend to be more bigoted against outsiders. If you interact with people of multi-races, if you travel a lot, if you do these kind of things, you actually do eliminate racism. Again, not implicit bias. I don't care about that. It's stupid. But the actual racist thoughts that you have in your conscious mind. So contact theory, the name I was a little unfamiliar with, but it obviously, again, no duh. It makes sense. If you are around people of other races and you humanize them, you're less bigoted. Shout out to Daryl Davis, who is a fantastic example of this. Those who don't know Daryl Davis, go look him up. He is an amazing person. He is a black, I think he plays the blues. I feel bad now. I'm unfamiliar with his music, but he's a black man who makes friends with members of the KKK and convinces them to give up that lifestyle. Again, because he humanizes the black face, by being a black man willing to have conversations with these, KKK morons. And that might, I don't care. And if you are a KKK member in 2020, you're kind of a moron. Again, it's important, what's outside the Overton window, the KKK. Yeah. So I don't feel bad insulting the KKK. Because some people out there would say like, well, you're name calling. Yeah, I think we can all agree that there are appropriate people to name call, and some of them are on the far ends of the spectrum. Anyway, contact theory, absolutely true. So again, point to the video. This is actually a good point.
prejudice. It's why something like segregation increases racist behaviors and ideas.
And finally, ideas and even science flourishes when diverse people work together. A study that analyzed the last names of 2.5 million research papers as a proxy for ethnicity found that when authors work with people of different races and backgrounds, their work received 10% more citations and prestige.
These are scientific.
So that's another study. I was not familiar with. So I'm not familiar with this study that shows that having a more diverse coalition of names at the top of your paper is going to lead you to more citations. Also, I'm curious what their criteria was. Are you looking at STEM journals, math and science, or are you talking about journals, quote unquote journals, that are like sociological in nature? Because everyone knows that those journals are garbage, and having a diverse sounding name at the top might just get you more publications. So I am actually very skeptical. Again, I don't know the criteria. It could be totally valid. I don't know the criteria, but it just sounds like nonsense. Again, it sounds like something that is not true.
Scientifically based studies that we use as examples of how to combat racism. The most important thing is to be aware that racism exists.
Aware that it is damaging.
Who knows?
And aware that it is up to you.
Does anyone believe that racism doesn't exist? Is there literally anyone who's making that case? Is there anyone at all? I follow a lot of prominent conservatives, a lot of prominent liberals. I know a lot of people. Is there anyone who says that racism doesn't exist? Anyone at all? I don't think so. What are you talking about? You have to know racism exists. Who's saying it doesn't? No one. No prominent person.
To combat it all together.
Wow. Wow, guys. I'm in awe. What a video. Definitely changed my mind. Look. Oh, actually, hold on. Look at that. That's how funny. So when it pops up, look, that's Daryl Davis right there. Fantastic dude. Everyone go watch his video, his interview with Joe Rogan. Maybe interesting guy. Very interesting, very cool dude. This just drives me nuts. This is exactly what I'm talking about. People use half science, half truths, misrepresent facts. They do all this stuff constantly, and then they impugn your motives when you disagree with them. Yesterday, after I pointed all this stuff out to someone, you know what they said? They said, well, obviously, you lack empathy for people of color, and you don't know or associate with black people. What kind of an argument is that? First of all, you obviously don't know anything about my personal life. That's just a ridiculous assertion to make about me as a person. The overwhelming majority of the time that I spend with people in my life, it tends to be with people who are minorities. I don't actually spend a lot of time with other white people. It's not because people are white or because people are minorities. That's just the way my life falls right now. And so the idea that I'm sitting here as some sort of white utopian, it's just ridiculous. And it's just one of those things. When you disagree with people about a political point, they will attribute the worst possible motives to you. I'm white, therefore I'm obviously anti-black. It's a stupid argument. It is a stupid, low IQ argument I don't have time for. Now, this video, it might be petty as hell, but it's also pertinent because this is the kind of stuff people talk about when they say, obviously racism exists. Look at this video. How could you refute it? Just like I did. Just like that. Because all of the things that people believe about racism in the system, they're not based on facts. They're based on feelings. This video is all about, look at this discrepancy and therefore racism. That's a terrible argument. Thomas Sowell talks about this constantly. Thomas Sowell, a black economist, talks about this constantly. This idea that discrepancy or disparity equals racism is a really bad argument. When we find racism, let's root it out at the root, right? Let's get it root and stem. Rip it up from the ground and get rid of it. I detest racism. I detest racists. I don't like bigotry in any form. But I'm not going to also pretend that there's a problem in areas where there are not problems. There are definitely problems that we could fix. But let's not just pretend everything's a problem and we got to tear the system down to rebuild it. That's a terrible argument. And it's also just untrue. It doesn't represent reality. And the whole thing is just nonsense on its face. Anyway, this is a longer episode. I kind of went off. I'm clearly not very happy with the way that this conversation has been going in the past week. Again, any racism we find, let's get rid of it. A racist cop, a racist law, a racist system that you can point to specifically and say, this is racist, I will agree with you. Let's get rid of it. That cop who kneeled on George Floyd's neck, let's get rid of him. I don't care if he's racist or not. If he is, that's all the worse. But let's get rid of him because he's a bad cop first. He's doing brutality first. And then we'll worry about whether or not Minneapolis PD is racist at its core. From what I saw, they fired him immediately and arrested him 2 days later. What are we talking about? That they're racist to the core? Don't you think they would have at least attempted to protect one of their own? No, because they were out there putting a statement saying, this is not what we stand for. Whenever we find racism, everyone condemns it. Everyone. You can find morons on Twitter who say stupid things, who make stupid jokes, but no prominent people in public life are out here supporting racism. No, find me one. People will say Donald Trump is a shit example. Pardon the language. I detest it to the core when we have conversations about broad issues and we're not specific about what we want to change. When we're specific, I'm with you. When we just make broad statements like the system is racist, that's a terrible argument. And when we use bad evidence like videos like this, it just drives me nuts because all it does is it's basically lying. It's basically lying to people. You know, you can interpret data in a whole bunch of ways, but what you can't do is give half-truths. You might as well be lying at that point. You could say, here's the data, here's how I think it reflects reality. But you have to make the argument as to why that is. Because if you're pointing to an outcome and saying, therefore racism, it's not a real argument. It's a bad argument. So anyway, we're going to leave it there today. This video was a little longer than I've been doing recently. And obviously, I'm a bit fired up. This whole conversation is kind of, it's just been upsetting. Not the conversation I had yesterday. Honestly, if you insult me on the internet, which I'm not unused to, it doesn't affect me on like a personal level. I tend to laugh. I think it's funny when people resort to name calling on the internet. It's like, oh, again, get a life. But I do have a real problem with the underlying argument that the entire country's been having. That's why I'm so passionate today. I've seen this argument. I see it on all sides just devolving. And I just don't like it because we're all in agreement. Racism is bad. Conservatives, Republicans, libertarians, liberals, progressives, everyone. We all agree racism is bad, except for the fringe morons on different sides, except for those people. And those people don't matter. They don't hold power. So let's all get in agreement. Black Lives Matter. Absolutely. Black people should have the same protection under the law and the same opportunities under the law. We all agree on this. Let's work towards making that happen, but let's be honest in the conversation. I'm going to leave it there today. I am Tyler Chrestman. I hope you guys have a fantastic day, and I will talk to you some other time.